All right, everybody. It's now 1 o'clock Pacific, 2 o'clock Mountain, 3 o'clock Central, and 4 o'clock Eastern. And if you're from New Zealand or Australia, then it's tomorrow already. And I want to know what the weather's like. So if we could go to the next slide, we will have all of you use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other. We're going to be using the chat throughout this session, and we're going to be using hashtags to allow us to create a chat summary later. So if you would just take one moment, use the hashtag hello and enter your name and your campus or organization in the chat window. We'll all get to know each other a little bit better, and then we'll get started as more people pop in to this AAEEBL meetup. Fantastic. All right, well, while you all say hello and introduce yourselves in this chat session, if we could go back to the first slide for just a second, I want to make sure everybody knows that they're in the right place. And so we are here with the Association for Authentic, Experiential, and Evidence-Based Learning, AAEEBL for short. And today we're going to discuss together how can students generate evidence of their learning in a remote world. So if we go 2 slides forward, you'll see the 3 of us, Gail Matthews-DeNatale, myself, Kevin Kelly, and Helen Chen. We're your intrepid leaders for today's adventure. And you can see that you can contact us by email or by Twitter, and we'll have this information again at the end of the presentation. We'll go to the next slide and we'll see a little bit more about AAEEBL. Since many of you in that registration form said, I am not familiar with AAEEBL. What is it? So we thought we'd give you at least a brief overview. We are an international, or if you prefer, the international community of practice for ePortfolio practitioners and researchers. And our goals are to share resources, best practices, and research to enable the effective integration of ePortfolios for deep learning and engagement. And we make a lot of contributions to the field, including a field guide to ePortfolios, the AAEEBL ePortfolio review. We're working with a task force led out of a group from Auburn University on some digital ethics, community of inquiry. And now we're doing things that don't even necessarily pertain to ePortfolios per se, but do pertain to authentic, experiential, and evidence-based learning, this meetup. So let's go to the next slide and see what we're all about. Today, if you remember from our scintillating and exciting description of our session, had 3 main goals. And so the topics that we want to explore with you today relate to evidence. How do we help students document and reflect on their learning remotely? Equity. How do we remove barriers to successful remote learning? And flexibility. How do we create multiple pathways for students to generate that evidence of learning, again, in a remote sense, since most, if not all of us, are doing this in a remote course format. See in the chat questions about being recorded, and yes, we are creating recordings, and we'll create a transcript, and we'll send out some emails with the information tomorrow once we've recovered and had a beverage. All right, on the next slide, we would love to hear from you because obviously we all define things differently. So in the chat, please use the hashtag definitions and a hashtag for one of the terms to share briefly, 5 to 10 words, what each of these words means to you. While you all type, I'll share the definition for equity that I've co-created with the Peralta Community College District in Oakland, California. And it's freedom from bias, assumptions, or institutional barriers that negatively impact students' motivation, opportunities, or achievement. So that's how we're defining equity. And I see that we have people putting things in there. Evidence is making learning visible, had a couple different things, and then some specifics like artifacts, how we make that learning visible. I see under flexibility, we've got providing opportunities, equity. My identity does not lead to barriers, similar to what we heard from the Peralta definition, removing barriers. Ava talks about flexibility equaling or being the same as allowances. Leanne, thanks for the equity pertaining to student choice. We'll be talking about that. So obviously we have quite a few ideas from the crowd here. We again are going to scrape this chat and summarize it. So thank you so much for using the hashtags because that makes it a lot easier. While you continue to enter your definitions for evidence, equity, and flexibility, the three themes for today's meetup, let's move to the next slide. So when you all registered for this session, you also included your biggest questions. And so those questions included, how do we assess? Especially people who are new to remote teaching and learning want to know how to assess in an online environment. What assessment processes and tools are effective and don't increase our workload. And then people are also asking about what actually constitutes evidence. So we tried to weave all of that into our presentations today. You also wanted to know about what to assess, and that ranged from different discipline-specific or topic-specific questions, people who might be teaching in fields that are a little bit more difficult to assess online, such as music or welding, career and technical education topics. We know we have a lot of composition and rhetoric instructors here from the demographics and the survey that you used to register. People also asked about reflection, which is often used in what we call folio thinking. We'll talk about that more. And higher level thinking. What workforce skills can we ask students to demonstrate over distance? And how do we get them to demonstrate that they're working in teams or with a specific community? And on the next slide, we have another set of biggest questions. A lot of questions related to student behaviors, especially how do we promote or foster academic integrity? How do we drive student engagement and motivation? And then, because equity and universal design for learning were themes that we referenced in our abstract, people asked questions about universal design itself, access being one of the equity issues people had the most questions about, access to technology and the internet. And again, a lot of people asked about how do we provide those multiple pathways for students to generate and share evidence of learning. So we are going to get to as many of these things as possible, knowing that this is what I'm calling the beginning of the conversation. So we expect that this will continue after today's meetup, but let's go to the next slide and see what we've got. Gail, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Kevin. As Helen and Kevin and I were talking about, in particular, the challenge of crash landing into remote emergency teaching, we realized that there was kind of an old friend that came to mind, and that's the backward design. Many, if not most of you, are familiar with this, but just to kind of reiterate, with backward design, we start with the end in mind. So what are the capabilities and the enduring understandings that we want our learners to develop? And then thinking about the experiences that they would need to have, whether it's readings or exercises or whatever, that would help them develop those capabilities and enduring understandings. Now, when we're thinking about evidence, the other thing that we kind of want to keep in mind is how can we build those learning experiences so that they also generate as evidence. So tests and exams or quizzes are often necessary, but it's also possible to develop the learning experiences so that they generate evidence along the way and can be used to determine, improve, and evaluate the attainment of goals. So it's not just at the end, but it's something that both we and our students can look to. So that was December, and this was January and February. All of a sudden, we found ourselves in a situation where we were not only asking those three questions, but we were also saying what really matters most. This sharpened our focus. We realized that we needed to zero in on those absolutely mission critical essentials. And thinking in terms of, because many of us were going online midstream, which ones of our things that we want for our learners can realistically be accomplished in a remote setting. And we started to look at those tools, the online spaces and the online tools in a different way in terms of helping our students be able to leverage those demonstrations. And so again, thinking about the learning assessments, what digital evidence can my students produce to determine, improve, and evaluate attainment of their goals? So this speaks back to what Biggs and Tang talk about with the constructively aligned system really creates an enveloped system in which communities can support each other. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples from my own practice. And as Helen and I, we were kind of comparing what we do within our classes. And then we backed up the train and said, well, you know, what do they evidence? And as we looked at the ones that I did in my teaching, we kept on doing this touchstone of benchmarking assignments and breaking major assignments down into chunks to make them more manageable, but also thinking and constructing those chunks in a way that each chunk generates some evidence of learning. So what do I mean by that? Well, at Northeastern University, we have a program called XN. And what XN is designed to do is to have students be able to take on experiential learning projects, but they're designed to be done completely online. So for example, in previous terms, I've had a student working with the public schools that they wanted to be applying for grants in a particular domain and doing some background research on whatever they wanted to apply for. I've had students that were working with HR to help them design trainings. I want to feature this example because it's just so relevant to what we've had happen from winter 2020. So at the outset of the project, in the second week of the course, I have a course wiki, and people describe the project that they want to undertake. They say what the goals are, and then we can, that's a way that, because it's in the wiki, we can talk a little bit about the plan and whether or not it's reasonable. This student in question, she teaches at a Sino-American school in Nanjing. And so the project that she wanted to do was to help her school develop a successful international counseling office. And that her project was to sort of benchmark and find out what other offices that were successful would do to develop a plan for implementing and assessing the effectiveness of a counseling office, and for engaging the staff at her school to bring them kind of into this global community. So that's what she started out with, and that's how she identified her scope in the early weeks of the wiki. She worked on that for about the course of maybe 9 weeks, 10 weeks. And at the outset, I thought, well, can we add another layer to this to help gather additional kinds of evidence beyond the wiki and beyond her final project? And so at Northeastern, we have a thing called SAIL, which is a framework of dimensions, skills, and masteries. We took a look at what hopefully all education would help our learners build, things like design thinking, systems thinking, perseverance, and resiliency. I took that framework, and because this is a capstone course, I compared it with our program outcomes and laid them out in front of the students. And I said, okay, you're not going to be able to do absolutely everything. If you focus on everything, you don't really focus on anything in particular. So of these possible things, pick 2 or 3 that as you do your XN project, you're going to be keeping an eye on. So for example, the learner that I was just speaking about with the Sino-American school picked strategic thinking. She's picked several, but I'm just going to focus on strategic thinking for a moment. And at the beginning of the term, I said, okay, take a look and think about the times that you think that strategic thinking has been relevant, an experience, recent experience, and do what we would call a self-calibration. What is a self-calibration? Sale would provide the definition for what we think strategic thinking is so that we can kind of know that what's in the bubble over everybody's head is pretty much the same. And we asked 4 questions, very basic, relatively concrete questions. You know, in the experience you have in mind, to what extent did you anticipate change and look for future opportunities? They rated themselves not at all to a great extent and wrote a little reflection going on with that. As the experience went on, I had them take what we call reflective moments periodically to revisit these skills and masteries and write a little bit about them, compare what was happening with their current project. So as I said, here's where she was in the beginning of her project wiki, and here's one of her reflections as she wound up revising her plan. And she realized that a lot of the things that she had planned to do, like coming together with the staff, just wasn't going to be possible. She'd gotten stuck in the United States, the staff was in quarantine, and so she began to shift how she was writing about her project to be what we can do now versus what we might be able to do one day. And so no matter how challenging the remote setting is, there's still a possibility to be thinking and describing what one might do if the current circumstances weren't getting in the way of some of those kinds of things. So that still involves a fairly detailed amount of thinking. So she says the deliverables have changed, but she's still thinking that she's gotten a fair amount out of it and she can talk about it. So by the end of the experience, she's got several calibrations. Here we have her baseline calibration and her final calibration. We've got a series of reflections where she's saying, okay, COVID-19 created all kinds of complications, but there were other complications. Still feeling pretty amazed at the fact that she was really able to meet any of the goals at all. And she had a kind of a summary report presentation. So I've got 3 different kinds of evidence, different categories of evidence, just with this one project. So let me talk about another example, my second and last example before I'll turn it back over to you. And this is gets into portfolios. AAEEBL is involved with the ePortfolios. Our focus has been that we've designed today so that you don't really need an ePortfolio to do any of these ideas that we're talking about, but it does help. We often think about portfolios as being for a person, their holistic representation of themselves, but projects can be portfolios. And so in this case, we use Digication, which is the ePortfolio software that we have at Northeastern, to create a template for a case study project for how people learn. The learners select a learning event that might be a kind of software and somebody learning how to use a software. That might be an online course, somebody what their experience is with the online course, and they document it. And it takes place over the span of 5 weeks. And each week they're working with a different section of this template. So as you see here, here are the prompts for the documentation that I asked for with the learner, some prompts for the documentation I asked when they documented the setting. Notably, at a certain point, I had them analyze and go back with the previous readings from the course and say what of the readings you've done seem to resonate with the documentation that you've done here. And when I look in the learning management system, I see this huge spike in access of the readings from the previous weeks. So that's yet another form of evidence that this assignment and their work is really driving them back into the readings in a deeper level. So and thinking about how to scaffold this in a way that is manageable, because it is a significant amount of work, I think in terms of how I strategically kind of interject myself. So at the beginning, helping them craft what kind of project they are going to work on, what are they going to look at, that's really important, and I'm there 100% of the way. In the interim weeks, say for example when they're doing the learner or the setting, I'm giving everybody in the class a rubric that has been turned into a feedback form, and so it guides their attention as they give each other peer feedback. It's not that I'm absent from the course, but I have found that they actually provide a significant amount of feedback where I would wind up going, yes, I agree with so-and-so. Toward the end of the case, say within the last couple of weeks, I come back in again with some very, very detailed feedback that will help them revise and improve. So multiple iterations of feedback around evidence is another piece that we found to be very important in terms of helping students document and improve their learning. So here are a couple of examples. This is one that a student did. She documented an online course and documented one learner's experience. In this case, it's a health professional. It's a course for helping health professionals become better writers. This one, which was one of my favorites, she documented a training at a fire station and took a look at how that might play out. As again, we talked with Kevin before of all the different types of learning that are out there, whether it's welding or what have you. And then just to put a bookmark in it, when we're thinking about equity and diversity and seeing our value, seeing our sense of belonging within a learning experience, that came up in your chat. These are opportunities, having it to be multiple topics that they can choose, also can help learners find the value in the learning that they already have within their communities and what they can bring to the table. So I thought I'd take a break here and go back to your turn. We've got the hashtag and we've crowdsourced some of the definitions that we have for things like evidence and equity and flexibility. Take a moment, use the hashtag benchmark, and we've given you a few prompts. One is, how have you structured your assignments to make them manageable? What digital evidence of learning have you asked your students to produce along the way? And as you do that, know that whatever you want to riff on with these questions, it's fine by me. You don't have to answer both of them. I'm just looking forward to seeing what you have to say.
And Erin got the ball rolling with her description of a project related to a project, portfolios related to a project for a first semester writing course. So hopefully there will be some way to see some of those portfolios, or if not, maybe when we create some sort of community space after this event, Erin can share maybe some of the prompts or some of the things that would allow people to replicate what she did.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when Erin's talking about doing primary research, and with any of these, being able to take some kind of documentation in my life around me, and being able to bring it to bear, is, I find, dramatically increases student engagement.
Brandy, I love the idea of elevator pitches.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, in live settings, I've tried to find refrigerator boxes that are being discarded from appliance stores and use that as the elevator where students get in that space and do their 1-minute elevator pitch. But since we're doing stay at home across most of the US, they could do it from a closet in a confessional format with their phone.
So we've got Samantha talking about structuring self-assessment and the peer feedback and class-generated rubrics. So if we're talking about evidence of learning, what are the benchmarks that we're using to evaluate the quality, and that the class can actually have a hand in being able to help co-create the expectations for excellence. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if we want to turn our attention. A lot of these elements you're already speaking to so eloquently within the chat. But if we look at the examples that I just had, one is that the evidence is multimodal. When you're online, there are all kinds of affordances. You can go way beyond text, and it can be produced over time to have those opportunities for feedback and improvement. In terms of equity, I know I said multimodal, but keeping in mind that it needs to be structured in a way that it can be scaled up or down. A simple wiki is pretty easy to access in terms of data and bandwidth, and sort of can be done with limited access to tools, and creating a pathway within, say, the rubric or the evaluation, so that people aren't penalized for not being able to maybe do stuff that's more bandwidth heavy. Going back to this idea of the flexibility, the choice of topic increases motivation, and depending on the assignment, it can also increase the learner's sense of belonging, or having something within their own unique life experience to be contributing in a way that is valid and honored. So I think I'd turn it over to you, Kevin. Is that where we go now?
And as kind of a transition point, while we're staying on this slide, there was a great email in a listserv for the Professional and Organizational Development Network, or the POD network, from someone at Harvard, and I will look it up and add it to the resources for this session. But it was, how do we look at science lab-based instruction and break up the lab experience into its component parts, or benchmarks, as you have referred to them, so that it is possible for students to generate evidence of learning, even though they can't get into a lab where they're setting up the beakers for chemistry or the petri dishes for biology. And I liked the way they framed it as, well, if you're trying to determine whether or not students can set up an experiment, maybe you can use a virtual lab or simulation. If you're trying to get at whether or not they're able to analyze and interpret data, then you could provide a data set rather than requiring them to collect the data from their own experiments and have them write that up and write a report. So there are definitely lots of great ideas out there. And so as we make these brief presentations on different topics, know that they're just a couple ideas of many, and we'll do our best to aggregate some that have been out in the digital space, but we're hoping that you'll share yours as well. Thanks, Kritika, for sharing that link. And so let's hop into the next topic, where I'd like to take a few approaches or pathways to describe multiple pathways. So on the next slide, extrapolating from example like Gail's reference to the Experiential Network project, one way to provide additional pathways for students to generate evidence of learning is to change the time frame. Gail described what we can do now versus what we might be able to do one day. In terms of folio thinking without ePortfolios, we can position this as reflections versus projections. Something that you did or are able to do or demonstrate live in some shape or fashion versus this is what I would do. And then for reflections, the evidence would be something, a photo of something you've done, a product you've created, a walkthrough video explaining why you did something a certain way, how you did something. For simulated evidence, this might be, again, an artifact that shows you understand the process but aren't able to demonstrate it live. Let's say for fire technology at the community college level, or welding for career and technical education. Some of those things, unless you have the equipment at home, you're not going to be able to demonstrate the evidence completely, but you could do for welding a plan or a drawing and walk your way through it in a screencast, maybe a think aloud video, if you've heard of those, where you're explaining your steps as you would go through them. On the next slide, it's a different way to approach time, and that's to provide students with multiple opportunities to show what they know over a specific period of time. So my own online class is called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device. And I broke it into 3-week modules that we cover throughout the semester. And we get into a pattern right at the beginning, where in week 1, they review some mini lectures and take some quizzes to demonstrate that they understand the core concepts we're going to be discussing over the next 3 weeks. And in that same week, they write a plan about something that interests them that they want to explore in their own lives. It could be something for another class. It could be a work-related training situation, or it could be something where they want to teach themselves how to do something at home, like cooking Indian food or playing the guitar. In week 2, we have group discussion posts and replies. And in week 3, those group discussions, the teams of 5 to 10 students summarize them, and then they write individually reflections on how their explorations went. And so you can see those are at different levels of depth, which for Universal Design for Learning, if you're familiar with that, providing different levels of challenge is one of their checkpoints that they recommend, as well as providing elements of choice. So students get to choose what they want to explore from the topics that are proposed in the mini lectures. And so they pick something that's the most relevant to them in their lives, whether it's school, work, or home. On the next slide, another way to frame multiple pathways for our classes and our students is a tool-based pathway. And we can ask some questions that'll help us decide what tools to use if we don't use electronic portfolios. And the questions are, who do you want to be able to see the artifacts that students produce, the evidence that they produce, and where will it live? Who owns it? And so you can see at the individual level, if you want it to be a one-to-one relationship between you and your students, in the learning management system, Canvas, Moodle, Blackboard, Desire to Learn, whatever tool your campus uses, there's an assignment tool, a quiz tool, that those are allow you an individual experience where you can provide feedback to that student directly. And outside the learning management system, you may ask them to email you some evidence of learning or put something in a common space like Dropbox. But if you want that evidence of learning to be visible for students to give peer feedback, for the whole class to learn from one another in a sense of student-generated content, or if you want the entire world to be able to see it because you're grappling with ideas that are important and timely, then in the learning management system, small groups or the entire class could use discussions, wikis, group pages, and similar tools for everyone to be able to generate feedback on what students are producing. And then outside the learning management system, you can play with the settings and permissions to either close things like an online gallery in Flickr or a class portfolio in Pathbright or Portfolium, so that students upload items into a common space instead of having their own portfolio. You could also use collaborative tools like Google Docs, VoiceThread, Flipgrid, and again, those can be set to be specific to a community like your class or open to the entire world. So providing students pathways for how they generate and show evidence of learning in a remote sense. This gives us a partial list. It's not a complete list, but it gives you a way to think about it. We will go to the next slide, Gail. Thank you. And so obviously we're setting forth a buffet for you here, and it's appropriate that there's a piece of cake on this slide because the buffet is rich. But this whole concept of adaptation pathways really asks us to start putting ourselves in our students' shoes, which is something we don't always do as teachers. And something I invite you all to do the next time you are creating an assignment for your students, pretend you're a student in your own class and see if you could complete that activity with only a smartphone. See if you could complete that activity without any device, or you have a device but you don't have internet connectivity or adequate internet connectivity. So here are just, again, a couple of examples. Drawing, since tomorrow is the anniversary, the 50-year anniversary of Apollo 13 returning to Earth after a major catastrophe could have caused this astronauts to expire. They had to figure out how to use what the astronauts had with them to fix a ventilation system, or they would have had carbon dioxide poisoning. Carbon dioxide, right? CO2, that's what plants like. And so they ended up using things like the astronaut socks as filters and all kinds of things. So, and while I was looking that up in my Firefox browser, I got a little advertisement for an article saying no flour, no eggs, no butter, no problem. You can still make a cake. And so it's that sense of we can adapt what we're doing to still make it possible to achieve the goals. That's where we get to these bullets on the left. And so I had in one of my fully online courses, a student tell me, hey, I know you want us to turn in papers as a PDF file, but I'm currently living in my car and I don't have Microsoft Word on my phone. I don't have a way to create PDFs. What do I do? So I changed the requirements then and there so that students could use whatever tool they wanted. But for that specific student, I told him that he could use Google Docs if he wanted to type with his thumbs, or if he didn't, he could use Dragon Naturally Speaking app to speak his essay into the phone, and then it would convert it to text. Since my class is an instructional technologies class, a general education course, and it's not a writing intensive course, I would be okay with grammar errors or things like that, as long as he can show me that he understands the concepts from the class. And lately, with this remote teaching and learning situation that we all find ourselves in, we know that some students are in stay-at-home situations where they may be sharing one device with, let's say, a couple of adults, some students in K-12 that need to finish school requirements, and so they may not be able to get to a device and submit something in a timely manner. But if we were to say, let them write out an essay in their notebook that they have at home or a scrap piece of paper they find in the recycle bin, they could then call a Google Voice number that we set up. It's free, has a voicemail mailbox, and the student could basically read their essay into the mailbox so that we could evaluate it with the same exact rubric that we used for the written work. And so we're starting to think of ways that we can allow students to adapt to the current circumstances, and we don't hopefully expect that this situation will last forever, but we know that they may reemerge. In Florida, hurricanes strike. In California, we have wildfires, so we do close our campuses, and we do want to make it possible for students who are in, let's say, less than ideal situations at home. And we want them to be able to participate and complete this thing successfully. The same type of approach could be taken for STEM instructors, whether it be math problems or physics problems or what have you. If the student doesn't have access to a computer right away, let them write them out and take a picture with their phone so that it's legible, but still provides them an avenue to submit. If we can do the next slide, we'll see that a case study from Laney College in that district I mentioned before, the Peralta Community College District in Oakland, California. I wanted to give this because it's something that could be done with students right now while they're staying at home. Alicia here teaches ethnic studies courses, and as part of our equity initiative, she changed what students were asked to do. Typically, she would ask them to watch a video and write a reflection on it. But in order to increase the meaning for them personally and possibly allow for the introduction of cultural perspectives, she asked them to watch the video for the class in some community setting. It could be with their family. It could be with their roommates if they're living away from home. It could be with people from their community if they're involved with a church or other community organization. But to watch that video with those others and lead a discussion about what the video meant to that group. And then write a reflection, not just on the video itself, but on the meaning of that video for that small group. And so This is something that people could do at in a stay from home situation. For most people, if they're with others. If they're not, then perhaps it's something where they could do it asynchronously to have multiple people watch it and provide their thinking before writing that reflection. Just wanted to throw that in because a lot of us right now, as we talk about equity, are focusing primarily on access to technology, but equity is a much larger Venn diagram, and so wanted to acknowledge that there's more to it than that. On the next slide, I wanted to point out one last type of pathway we can provide to our students, and that's one that involves choice. Again, pulling back on that universal design for learning concept, we can do something like a business faculty member at San Francisco State has essay exams, and he has switched to have 3 questions about each core concept he wants students to demonstrate that they understand. And the students get to pick which of the 3 questions they want to answer. And so that's a simple way to provide choice to students so that they can succeed in the way they feel most comfortable. We can also provide rubrics that allow the flexibility for how students submit their work. And we can provide prompts, similar to what we saw on the last slide with Alicia's work at Laney College, that students are able to inject meaningful life experiences or cultural perspectives into their responses, into their assessment writing or what have you. So on the next slide, I want to show for the class that I mentioned before that I teach, How to Learn with Your Mobile Device, my final project, I have students go through 2 steps. First, they write a draft. It could be an outline or a full draft essay, where they answer the question prompts about what they are taking away from the class, how they're going to use it in their lives, what they would do differently, stuff like that. And then they choose the format in which they want to submit it. And any one of these, as long as they've answered those questions, I can use the same rubric to grade the student's work. And they can do it in text format, some sort of online presentation, audio or video format, including that Google Voice message that I brought up before, a multimedia format, and I even put an other, but I usually ask them to check in with me to make sure it's something that I can download or read or accept. So on the next slide, it is your turn. Just like Gail asked you all to share your thoughts about those benchmarks, I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts about pathways. And in these 2 particular cases, I'm hoping that you'll share ways that you've provided choice to students, whether it be a choice of prompts or problems or formats. And also in these times when we are being more adaptive in our thinking and how we help students succeed, what adaptations have you shared with students, whether it be a time frame? Hey, we know you can't get to the welding lab, so we want you to be able to project what you would do when you have access to that equipment, or technology. Hey, we know you don't have a computer right now, so go ahead and use Google Docs to submit that work. Be interested to see how you all are providing multiple pathways for your students to generate and share evidence of learning remotely. And we see Maria gives options for the final project, and they have different formats, so it's a little of both. Team formation from Jess. And I like the fact that you're acknowledging that they may need help staying in time zone teams, right? So some of us are people, as the students left our institutions and went home, that could be outside the country. Camille shared options of presentation format. Candace, the adaptation is to have no set due dates and providing students more of a self-paced pathway with formative feedback. Love that. The challenge there is to make sure that they space out the work so they're not saving it to the end. Barbara, team formation and presentation using Collaborate Ultra and creating slides through Google Doc. Nice. Kathleen Yancey says the phone camera can capture all kinds of work. So true. And Kritika from Stanford, bringing in-person convos with friends and family into the online course discussion. It's a take on what I shared from that ethnic studies professor from Laney College. Nice. All right, well, in the interest of time, while you all continue to add your thoughts, I will wrap up my section by saying that we can summarize what I described with some of the major question words. The evidence, we reconsider what constitutes evidence when we think about when it's generated and who will see it. For equity, we're addressing access issues, how students submit their work or complete their work, but we can also foster diversity, inclusion, and personal meaning by thinking about what it is that we're asking students to generate and how they can include their personal perspectives. And last, for flexibility, we give students a choice of topics or formats and a chance to adapt, which addresses questions like how, what, and why. I'm going to hand the talking stick over to Helen Chen to close us out.
Great. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you here. So in this last section, I just want to first start off by talking about some different kinds of assessment approaches and options. And on the next slide, I mean, the context for all of this really is the recognition that we have almost 200 schools, perhaps more now, that have gone to these pass-fail policies for their students. And that has raised a lot of questions about how we grade, do we grade, what's going to be motivating to students to encourage them to continue to work and study hard. We've certainly had some students, here at Stanford decide to take a leave of absence. I mean, I think all of the kinds of, concerns, questions about online education, which of course it's been well documented and pointed out, this is not online education. This is emergency remote teaching, as both faculty and students and staff try to figure out how do we manage in this situation and finish off the year strong. The next slide begins to highlight, sort of this question, and I especially appreciate a colleague of mine in Stanford Introductory Studies, Lori Dietz, who kind of proposed sort of this idea, this sort of Mad Lib idea. So if we really take it down to basics, this idea like, I will consider this a successful class if students know fill in the blank and or can fill in the blank by the end of the class. We know that fill in the blank really sort of maps back to learning outcomes, learning goals. What do you want your students to be able to know and be able to do by the end of your revised course? And how do they demonstrate that? And that was really the impetus behind today's conversation. If we go to the next slide, there are some really terrific resources which we will share in our follow-up with you. And I just pulled some of these from some of the work being done at Rutgers, UC Berkeley, IU Bloomington, and so on, about what some of these examples of alternative assessment approaches might be. At Stanford, we've also gone, what we're calling satisfactory, no credit, and there are no finals. There's no finals week. And so what do we do? Some of the faculty that I work with in mechanical engineering, have asked that question, okay, with no finals, how do I grade? How do I assess? What do I offer? And so what I appreciate about some of these resources and examples are, some kinds of alternatives, whether it's developing a fact sheet, that could be distributed to the public, a policy memo, how do you leverage, some of the video conferencing technology to conduct virtual poster sessions. And certainly some faculty have said, it's now easier to actually bring in guest speakers or invite people to come join the class and offer their perspectives. So a lot is opened up there. And so we'll be sure to share these with you to give you some additional ideas. Where I would like to pivot and really building off some of the ideas that Gail and Kevin have mentioned earlier, if we see on the next slide, this question of how can we engage students? what's in it for students in terms of motivating them to generate evidence of their learning in a remote world. Gail and Kevin gave some fantastic examples of, certainly the perspective of faculty and instructors. How do we generate evidence of what they're learning, to fulfill the learning outcomes and goals of our courses? But for students, what's in it for them, and why do they need to generate evidence? On the next slide, these are just pulled from the headlines in terms of some of the concerns and worries I think that we increasingly have for our students. Certainly students whose summer internship or research or fellowship plans for the summer have been canceled, for our graduating seniors or students who are now, sort of entering the workforce or looking for jobs as they're going to school, what is that market going to look like for them? And this is sort of just the reality I think all of us are facing as we consider potential budget cuts and belt tightening at our institutions, So this idea of in terms of being able to have evidence of what you know and can do is becoming even more critical. And for students to also be able to know that the work that they're doing, that they may be turning in for, for example, projects and so on, that actually can also be something that can be helpful for them as they're looking for, for jobs, for internships, other kinds of positions. So if we go to the next slide, we can then begin to consider, as we think about where evidence might reside, the evidence that students might use that, could actually be part of and be referenced in, for example, a LinkedIn profile, could be described in a cover letter, or resume and so on. These are some of the considerations that, that might be particularly important for students. And of course, we see portfolios as part of this. Now, if we go to the next slide and we talk about sort of why portfolios, this question of the portfolio being a place where students are able to tell the story of who they are, their education, their experience, not just the experience that they have developed, within, on campuses and so on, but prior life experiences, other kinds of activities that they may be a part of. And what might that portfolio be able to reveal about them that these other kinds of profiles and records do not? So to be able to tell that more holistic message, that sort of comprehensive story about who they are, to give them greater control and ownership to really communicate their experiences and their particular values, to provide greater context about where they come from, the challenges that they face, what they've been able to accomplish, and to also increasingly be able to differentiate themselves, from other kinds of platforms that really focus on standardization. Even though we recognize that LinkedIn is sort of your common, currency for professional networking and so on, but the portfolio allows them to tell their own story. So if we go to the next slide, this idea of looking at evidence in a portfolio, a colleague of mine from the program in Writing and Rhetoric talks about the portfolio as representing a rhetorical argument that has a thesis or a claim that really has to be backed up by evidence. And so some examples of artifacts that become part of that evidence might be, again, we've talked about pictures and images, videos, research papers, teaching moments, key kinds of learning experiences. Those are sort of examples of the artifacts, but taken together, in terms of representing or illustrating how this comes together. If you see in this example portfolio, the thesis being a product designer focused on on creating educational products that help people teach and learn. And at the bottom right there are 3 examples of projects that he's worked on. If we go to the next slide, where I'd like to go with this, and I know we're running short on time, but as you think about your own students, how and where could you help your students, curate their learning as broadly defined, both translate and apply what they're learning, and then also providing them with opportunities to practice telling their story of their education as well as their experience. So Kevin, do we have time for this, or should I go ahead and wrap up, or what do you think would work best?
Absolutely. We started a couple minutes late to make sure everybody could get in. So we will make sure we have time for people to share their ideas, especially because that student perspective is so important to keep in mind as we do this work.
Great. So yeah, we would love to have your input here. And again, I know that, again, just kind of bring it all in. We'll be summarizing all of this to be able to share with you later. I really appreciate, Kritika, your example of Medium pieces or blogging and so on. Increasingly, this idea of thought leadership and how one might leverage social media, for example, to demonstrate thought leadership. And that also can be using LinkedIn, for example, as a publishing platform.
And a project that I've done in the past is to have a group submission to the public where we wrote student versions of the 7 Things You Should Know series from EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative. And we would, because those are typically written from the faculty perspective, we rewrote them from the student perspective and posted them online. So definitely that whole concept makes everyone better for it.
Yes, and I think Anne, I think your example of telling them your story and show really modeling for them, I think that actually is a really terrific example as well. And Sam, I see like students creating process journals. Again, the application, and especially as we're looking at how this might be sort of applicable and relevant, particularly for students in engineering and other STEM fields as well.
So while we see these ideas go into the chat, and I encourage everyone to keep writing them, maybe Helen, you can summarize
Sure.
your section, and then we'll give people some information about next steps.
That sounds great. So again, in summary, this idea of, as we're thinking about evidence, and again, Gail alluded to this as well, communicating in multiple modes, to recognize that, evidence can take the form in both textual form, visual, oral, and also acknowledging the different kinds of audiences that as we encourage the students to think about the value and the application of what they're learning for audiences beyond our campuses. The question about equity, I think, is really important in terms of recognizing the complexity and diversity of digital identities and representations, knowing that when students step foot on our campuses, they aren't blank slates. They've had rich experiences that inform and they can inform who they are, and also identities that they continue to develop while they're on our campuses, as they move inside and outside the classroom, on campus and off campus, summer, during the academic school year and so on. And how do we actually give them, and this is where the flexibility comes in, that agency and choice to be able to represent the different aspects of their education. We've heard it before, of course, we're not just preparing students for that first job when they graduate. It's going to be the 5th job, the 10th job, the job that doesn't even exist. And how do we really empower them with respect to those kinds of skills and really make sure that they own it, so that when they walk across that stage at graduation, they're not defining themselves by their major as the typical sort of, standard introduction, but they're really defining themselves by what they know and what they can do and can demonstrate how they apply that to wherever they may go in the future.
Fantastic. Well, we have just enough time for the next slide to wrap it up. So the Meetup wrap up in just a minute. So we'll be following up with some additional resources by next Friday, but tomorrow you will get a thank you email with some preliminary information. But our commitment, again, we're a small but mighty team, but we're going to transcribe this audio and we're going to provide the slides and the link to the recording and put together some other resources. I've created a Google Doc with all of your biggest questions from the registration form, so there'll be quite a bit there to continue the conversation, as we are saying. And so we hope that you'll continue with questions and thoughts and contributions of your own. And if you are new to AAEEBL, if you've never heard of it before, the website right there, aabl.org, AAEEBL.org for the transcriber. Let's go to the next slide and see what else we have. Oh, that's right. We're going to do another online event. And this one will be related to defining digital ethics, and we'll be doing a Trans-Pacific AAEEBL and ePortfolios Australia co-hosted webinar or online event. And so we hope that you'll join us for that. It's going to be a little bit trickier because we have to squeeze in times that work for both Australia and North America. So it'll get a little bit late for the folks on the Eastern time zone, but we will be recording it and hope that people will join us. And on the very last slide, obviously, we want to say thank you, and we appreciate you joining us. Share the information with your colleagues who were not able to attend. And then feel free to contact us. Again, our emails and our Twitter handles are on this slide here. And Gail, Helen, and I are willing to stay on for a little bit longer to answer any questions in the chat that people have just pressing need and they can't wait till next week. Go ahead and ask it and we'll see what we can do. But we know people have to run to their next meetings. And on the East Coast, it's now time to open a bottle of wine or something like that and feed the kids and the dogs and all that. And wow, you're welcome from America to Beirut. We're excited that this is an international session.
Great, thanks everyone.